Welcome back, everybody, to Post Wrestling. It is John Pollock here with you. Back in 1992, the World Wrestling Federation was rocked by several scandals, including one that has often just been referred to as the Ring Boy scandal, and it's centered around alleged inappropriate behavior with underage children, solicitation of sex acts by an executive, and was the subject of great scrutiny among the tabloid press in the early 90s and wrestling newsletter coverage. David Bixenspan has dug into the story, uncovering new facts and statements from WWE's longtime legal representative, Jerry McDivitt. He is here to speak about his recent feature on the scandal that's available now at businessinsider.com. David, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a very complex story that goes back decades. I want to kind of just start you grew up in the Northeast, and when did you first, were you aware of the coverage at the time in the early 90s? Did this kind of precede, your awareness at that level of, what was going on with the World Wrestling Federation? When did this kind of come onto your radar? Because it's a story that I would say even longtime followers of the product, I think it's maybe sketchy at best, the details, the specific ones that you go into in this big feature.
Yeah. So I'll answer that last part first, which is that, I guess it wasn't a question, but just to elaborate on what you said there, something that I've noticed, especially when, I don't know if you saw any of this on Twitter, there have been people from this wrestling subforum on Something Awful have done a couple, quote unquote tournaments where they vote for, worst promotional tactic in WWE history, worst person in WWE history, stuff like that. And stuff like this came up, and there were a ton of people in the forum threads and the Twitter threads saying they had never heard of this. And these are super hardcore fans. So it's something that's below a lot of people's radar. As for me, because I'm from Long Island, even though I was a little kid at the time, I was at least somewhat aware of this because I was listening to John Arezzi's radio show, and he was very on top of all this. And that was also the time where, stemming from some plugs on his show, I had gotten my initial, sample issues of The Torch and The Observer. And some of that all overlapped, and I think also with maybe one of John Arezzi's newsletter issues too. So, I had an awareness, and then as I got a little older, when I still had some of that stuff, rereading it, and, until I think more stuff became available on the internet, I don't know how much I came back to it, but, I feel like I was pretty at least well-versed in what was out there, like the retrospectives in The Observer, like some of the contemporaneous newsletter coverage, Tom Cole's interview with Wrestling Perspective from 99, because that had been online for years. So I feel like I knew all that, but I knew obviously there could be more to find. And then it turned out not only was there more to find, but there was stuff that was already out there that had just been kind of forgotten.
So a number of the key players involved in this are ones that may ring a bell to people, but I think we should kind of go over kind of the primary people involved. And we can start with Mel Phillips. This is someone that you've probably seen him, but maybe
less lately now that he's edited off of the network as much as possible.
Well, that certainly leads into this. But why don't you talk a little bit about Mel Phillips' role with the company and what he was accused of, because he really is the kind of, I will say, one of the central figures involved.
Yes. So Mel Phillips started on the ring crew, I believe, in the mid-70s. And at some point, I would say early 80s or thereabouts, he started doing work as a ring announcer. I would say, I don't think it's an exaggeration, that he eventually got to the level of being the number 2 ring announcer in the company behind Howard Finkel. If you were at a house show and it was not Finkel and it was one of the TV ring announcers, it was usually him. I don't even know if when she was on, if Mike McGurk ever did house shows, actually, now that I think about it. But, he was pretty visible for a while. The first year and a half or so of Wrestling Challenge, he's the ring announcer every single week. Even later on, like the Tokyo Dome shows, with All Japan and SWS, he's the WWF ring announcer on those. And then the other thing I guess people would remember him from would be before he was a TV ring announcer, he was still seen as like a ring attendant taking jackets and stuff on TV. And early in Terry Funk's WWF run, I think even his debut, they do a thing where Funk gives him his stuff, and as he's taking it away, Phillips puts the cowboy hat on his head, and Funk beats him up for it. So I guess that's what people would know him from. And then as it would come out in 92, he had been, apparently, because we have multiple allegations of this, abusing children. Either, some of this, it's hard to tell if he escalated further with some of them, or if this was like a test of his, or he took certain risks differently with different people, but either grooming them and asking them to rub their feet on his groin, or in some cases, especially with kids who asked if wrestling was fake or otherwise, quote unquote, disrespected the business, stomping on their foot or wrenching their toes as like punishment, and then sometimes massaging their feet after.
Yeah, and like the aspect of like the foot fetish doesn't seem to be like, that is not disputed by anybody. And
no.
you're talking about children, like it's pretty alarming and I think we should mention off the fact, like we're going to be getting into some graphic details, but I think to do the story justice, you have to get into these details.
I'm sure you'll have the description and stuff.
So I mean, that part is, and that seems to be a bit of the tone you get in the feature, David, is the fact that it was this well-known thing. I mean, this is brought up in Bobby Heenan's book, in Bret Hart's book. I mean, this is what Mel Phillips was known for. And the fact that there were children involved, it almost seemed to be like this, almost like a rationalization of such that, how far beyond this did it go? And it seems like based on the accusations, like that there are accusations that it went a lot further than simply touching feet. It went to a sexual nature.
Yeah. And I think part of why also even people who are kind of aware of the scandal aren't aware of that is, I think part of it is just Tom Cole, because of, the cycle of, unfortunately, of how all this goes for someone who went through that, and the associated shame and stuff that's there, even though they didn't do anything wrong. Tom Cole, as the years went on, he never changed his story, but he would give less details when he was talking about what happened. And I think because of that, for example, he doesn't actually say what happened that Phillips did to him in the Wrestling Perspective interview, for example. And I think also that like some of the other coverage was more, vague at the time. I think just even to people who are decently well read on this, I don't think they realized that that was like the main allegation. We have, depending on exactly how you read them, although most of these were not known publicly at the time, we have at least 3 allegations along those lines, and then at least another 2 with, the foot abuse, kind of more, you disrespected the business stuff. So I think that's,
and Tom Cole really does become, you also talk about Chris Loss in this feature, but it is Tom Cole throughout this coverage that is the one front and center that is bringing up not just the allegations against Mel Phillips, but also, and this can lead into Terry Garvin as well. And Tom Cole becomes the public face of this scandal in terms of the victim in this.
Yes, he's the name that people know if they know a name. So he was in, many ways kind of the typical kid that Phillips seemed to go after. Kind of a, broken home, loved wrestling, wanted to find way into the wrestling business as an escape. And it was him and Chris Lose that talked to Jeff Savage at the San Diego Union Tribune for the article that came out in March 92. And he's the one who would then, technically in 92, he did not sue WWE or, Garvin Phillips or Pat Patterson or anyone else. His lawyer drafted a complaint, which is linked in the article and quoted a little bit, and they settled before it could get to court. And the reason we have the complaint, it was filed as an exhibit later on when WWE sued Phil Mushnick and the New York Post for defamation. So that's why we have that. And he comes forward. It basically what happened was he was, I believe, living with his older brother Lee at the time. This is in like around summer 92. I think Lee is reading the New York Post with coverage from Phil Mushnick of the Zahorian stuff. And he says something like, "What happened with you and the wrestling stuff anyway?" And Tom at first doesn't really want to talk about it and says something like, "Oh, it's so much worse than just the steroid stuff." And he ends up telling his brother what happened. And Lee realizes they need to do something about it. He reaches out to Phil Mushnick. Phil Mushnick talks to them. This isn't for certain, but my understanding as to why it went to Jeff Savage is that Jeff Savage was more of a reporter, with Phil being more of a columnist. Mm-hmm. And he runs that story. He had not, famously, you look at like the Observer coverage at the time, he had not been able to get any kind of comment from WWE for weeks. Like that story, I believe, was supposed to have originally come out several weeks earlier. And then finally comes out. And then it's like literally within a week or so that you have Mushnick's coverage of it, blowing it up more. Vince on Larry King, Vince on Donahue, the Cole settlement. All that's only within like a week or so. Like it's a almost shockingly compressed time frame.
And it's really where the like for people's knowledge base, it's going off of, I think, a lot of those media appearances by Vince McMahon that are readily available. And that's kind of people's, your cursory knowledge of this story is probably limited to what you saw on Larry King or the Donahue show, unless you dug further.
Yeah. And unfortunately, there are also some problems with that too. I mean, one of which namely is that the Donahue episode, for whatever reason, don't know why, even though the title of the episode, because I have the official transcript, because the official transcript of that, the Larry King episode, and Geraldo's Now It Can Be Told episode were all exhibits at points of the Mushnick lawsuit. The title of the episode is Pro Wrestling Empire Hit with Teen Boys Sex Scandal. And in spite of that, don't know why, the Ring Boy stuff is barely mentioned in the Donahue episode. It's kind of strange. And I think that contributes to people's understanding. Larry King, it comes up some, but that's when Vince says, "This is the first time hearing of it." And also it's a strange thing to watch in general because Vince is almost playing the heel more. Like he really doesn't know how to react to this because he's never had this kind of scrutiny. And then he does this 180 in terms of tone on Donahue, 3 days later. Although, of course, he knows at that time that he has Tom Cole having settled. But it's like there's not really enough of the information you need there. So I think those being the things people go to first means that when they hear about this stuff, the first thing they're going to think of probably most likely is Murray Hodgson's sexual harassment allegations against Pat Patterson, which turned out to be completely fabricated.
So in terms of Tom Cole, he is someone that, I mean, he has been very limited in, he did a lot of interviews, or a handful of interviews around this particular time. You mentioned the Wrestling Perspective interview in 1999, and would just pop up every now and then. And while his story has never changed, it does seem that his the responsibility he places, especially on Linda McMahon, has shifted back and forth. And I think that's been, I guess, a cause of Tom Cole and, it's been a very complex relationship with the McMahons themselves of what has been, what was their responsibility and what he absolved them of. And it's kind of flipped,
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't able to talk to him on the record for this, so, I wish I had his current perspective. Hard to say exactly where it is, but I mean, one thing I can tell you that I know, like, I remember, I believe there was like I think it was a comment maybe on Irv Mushnick's blog back in 2010 when really the last anyone heard from him publicly. Well, I shouldn't say that. He did an interview with Mike Mooneyham right after that too. That was a little bit more in depth, but it was either he or his brother, I forget which, posted a comment like thinking that Irv Mushnick had given their phone number out to other reporters when it was, no, they, at the time, they wouldn't have realized that reporters use databases like LexisNexis and things like that to find that kind of stuff. And you get the vibe, though, that he didn't really want to talk to reporters, just generally. So it seems like that may have been part of why he just kind of, at the time, it seemed like he wanted to just in one fell swoop make sure that no one was talking to him again. But that's kind of spitballing on my part, just kind of gleaning from the other information. But
well, I believe it's a Wrestling Perspective interview. I mean, he does talk about having a pretty bad experience with the Geraldo program. Now it can be told, and just seeing this as like, this is, he's just a prop here for this show. And I think that was the experience he took away. And I guess you could understand in his situation that it becomes very easy to just paintbrush all of the media as just looking at him as just their latest story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's other reasons too. Like, not only that, which was that, as the way both Coles have described it, Brooke Skolsky, who was one of the producers, basically said, if you don't give me an interview, I'm going to camp out on your lawn. And obviously you can see why you would give in to that. But, at the time, even Tom had the wherewithal to demand that they write up a contract that the interview could only be aired after he filed a lawsuit, which is why the interview never aired, although he still had to get his lawyer to file a restraining order to keep it from airing because they were still going to try to air it in spite of having a signed contract that said he had to file a lawsuit first. But, I mean, they've been burned too. This isn't something that's talked about a lot, but in 93, NBC News, it was a show that's not on anymore. It was one of the various zillion, like, Sunday night, news magazine shows they've had over the years. They were going to do a major feature on all this. And this is in 93. So this is like leading into when Vince is indicted leading up to steroid trial. This is, over a year and a half after all of the initial coverage. And that story ends up kind of dissolving. It's seeming in part because of the actions of Marty Bergman, who it would turn out was the husband of one of the defense attorneys for McMahon WWF Laura Brevetti, fiance at the time, but which was a thing no one really knew. And he was involved with helping plant stories and stuff. And there was this big story in the New York Observer that was trying to frame it like they were blowing this story and it was going to be like their next version of the exploding truck story that got them sued about defective trucks that turned out to not be entirely true. And there's this whole, I mean, I don't want to get too in the weeds because there's this whole thing with that story where there's an old WWF employee who had a tape that apparently showed Phillips wrestling with kids in the background or something. And there was this whole rigmarole over the guy wanting to send it to NBC and then stopping it and then the prosecutors picking it up. But anyway, like that was all kind of twisted into this thing where it's, as far as anyone could tell, got the story killed. So you can absolutely see a number of reasons why both Coles, or really anyone else involved seeing what else happened, might have a reticence, whether to talk or whatever.
So just keeping this on the timeline. So Tom Cole in 1992 ultimately ends up settling with WWF, gets his old job back, and then remains in the company until June of 1993 when he receives a letter and Linda McMahon informs him that they're very disappointed. They had been paying for his schooling. He's not doing very well. and he's ultimately let go in June of 93. Is that accurate?
Yeah, we probably should double back to talk about the Terry Garvin thing, though.
Yeah, why don't we go over the Terry Garvin aspect?
Yes, so Terry Garvin, real name Terry Joyelle, wrestler going back to the late 50s, I believe. As far as I know, I think Pat Patterson and him were childhood friends, even. The story goes that it was them and Chin Lee all grew up in the same neighborhood, and then in, their teens and early adulthood all went to Boston together to break into wrestling through Tony Santos's promotion. And, he had been a fairly big name wrestler, the worked brother of Ron and Jimmy Garvin. He was the original. Then he was teaming with Ron and Jimmy, who was Ron's stepson and was like 17 or 18 at the time, was their manager. And he sort of started in, like late 70s, transitioning into office roles, working in Kansas City and Amarillo and other places like that. And at some point after Patterson got into power, I'm not sure exactly when, in the WWF, Garvin was brought on as basically his number two. And this is where it gets a little tricky to try to figure out. Clearly, there's some awareness that there's something going on with him. It's just hard to know exactly what. Because for years, more so on, I would say, like the house show announcing, there would always be these jokes about certain wrestlers being graduates of the Terry Garvin School of Self-Defense,
yes.
Which, like I've said when this has been brought up other times, is that simply a homophobic joke because they knew he was having relationships with men or tryst with men? Or is it something more sinister because, the self-defense part? I don't know.
It ages terribly, but
it ages terribly either way.
It ages terribly regardless, but you're right. I don't know if you can make that leap of how prevalent this was known beyond, the homosexual aspect. How widespread was this known? But it certainly opens up that debate. Right.
So, there are other stories too. In Shawn Assail and Mike Mooneyham's book, Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, they quote Nelson Swegler, who, if I'm remembering right, ran TV for WWF before Kevin Dunn, and as the book frames it, was also an operations manager of some kind for WWF. He described seeing Terry Garvin, he said, I think he went into a tour bus and found Terry Garvin, the words he used were hard at it with someone he described as a ring boy, but he didn't give an age or anything. But, we need to mention too, Garvin was Phillips's direct superior.
Yeah, that's a part that often gets overlooked is the power dynamic in all of this as well that Terry Garvin holds over a Tom Cole or others.
Right. So Tom Cole had, up until 1990, from the time he started going on the road at times in 85, 86, I think 85 is when the complaint he filed said, he had just been, a day labor ring setup guy, and ring attendant. He wasn't, not that he would be an employee anyway, necessarily for a lot of this, but still, he was not, and how do I put it? It's not like how, Tony Chimmel was on the ring crew or people like that in terms of it being their job. He's just a guy that's being, I think, hired out of money that Phillips and whoever are given to Poole. In 1990, he got a job as a warehouse manager at the WWF warehouse, and the day before he's supposed to first report to work, Terry Garvin invites him over to his house to go over ring crew assignments because he's still doing that work as well, but I guess on a more formal basis, and turns on a porn movie and basically starts propositioning him. And according to Tom Cole's account, he basically runs out of there, sleeps outside in the van, and then goes to the warehouse where Mel Phillips fires him and basically says, "You know why," or something to that effect. And should know too, so Tom Cole's 19 at this time in 1990.
Mm-hmm.
He says there was also a similar incident with Garvin when he was 16 as well. And at least in their email to us, WWE doesn't really seem to be denying that either.
Yeah, this is one of the statements that Jerry McDivitt provided, the article here. The only persons implicated were not senior officials, nor were there any claims of anything approximating conventional forms of sexual abuse such as rape, sodomy, etc. Instead, claimed Mel Phillips had a foot fetish and played with his feet. He also claimed that any allegations against the McMahons were, quote, classic libel.
Well, I guess here is where we should get into why that's a very strange thing to say. Well, okay, look, the first part of the quote is a strange thing to say no matter what. And as someone who, regardless of any conflicts here, thinks that Jerry McDevitt is an excellent lawyer, I have no idea why he said that thing about conventional forms of sexual abuse.
Like, at its very base, there is no disputing that this was a man in Mel Phillips with a foot fetish around young children, and that alone is alarming.
Yes.
To say the absolute least, if that's the foundation that we're working on for any kind of a defense.
Right. Even if everyone's conceding that that's true, which it seems like they are to some degree, then what are they even saying? That it wasn't criminal, but he did something? Like, I don't even get exactly what they're saying there. But so here's the thing, though, and we needed to get this anyway, and it's something I want to talk about a bit. So what I'm about to say has always been out there, and for some reason everyone just forgot about it. Like I kind of alluded to up front when we started. So about a week or so before the story breaks in 92, Vince McMahon has phone calls with both Dave Meltzer and Phil Mushnick. This is before Phil Mushnick is his mortal enemy. He's trying to good cop him. And he tells both of them, let me actually pull up the right part of the article so I'm using the exact language. So during those calls, and he would write about this a couple weeks later, Mushnick would, after seeing Vince say on Larry King that he had no idea anything was happening. I'll just read the quote. This is what he wrote in his column, which on that day was the cover story for the sports section of the Post.
All right. This is Phil Mushnick.
Yes. 2 weeks ago, during his hard-out phone calls, McMahon told West Coast-based journalist Dave Meltzer, then me, that he had let Phillips go 4 years ago because Phillips' relationship with the kid seemed peculiar and unnatural. McMahon said he rehired Phillips with the caveat that Phillips steer clear from kids. And Dave told me that that was an accurate account of his phone call with Vince as well. And, when Vince would then sue Mushnick in the Post in Mushnick's deposition, he would expand a bit on that. He would recall that Vince said that it was he and Linda who made the decision together. And at no time in the past almost 29 years since all this happened, since this phone call, the only acknowledgement that this happened from the WWE side that I can find, whether it's media, court records, or, now this correspondence, leading up to this article, the only acknowledgement of that conversation is asking him about it in the deposition. And even then, it's not in a combative way. They've never denied this, but they've never really acknowledged it. And the other thing that's very strange about it is everyone forgot. I don't know why. I mean, part of it is that I think that, and this is the part I really don't understand, Dave and Phil didn't make it a big part of their coverage. With Phil's thing, it's just one of many lies he's saying Vince McMahon told. With Dave, it's a little less clear. I remember asking him when I talked to him originally for this article, he couldn't remember why it hadn't been a bigger deal and why it wasn't really talked about later. But and I'm not saying this to crap on or blame Dave or anything, but it never ended up in any of his retrospectives on this, and he's done a few. It's not in any real narrative you can find about all this, even though it was all out there. There's parts that's a little weird, like Dave when he writes about like Phil's column, he leaves out what Phil said about him. And when he had like a week or two earlier kind of alluded to the conversation with Vince, like, but it was one of those things where if you didn't know this part, it wasn't clear what he was talking about, but would become clear in hindsight. And as a result, like, something that should be front and center of what everyone knows just has been buried. Like, I don't remember ever hearing anyone mention this until I started researching this a while back.
Yeah, and this is mentioned in the Geraldo piece. Like, they briefly do note that he was let go in 1988, but then quickly rehired. But they don't really expand upon it beyond that.
Right. Or that Vince admitted it. I'm not sure if they even mentioned.
I don't think so. And that becomes like a very important part to this story, is that he was let go in 1988, and ultimately, like, there has to be a reason for that. And that's, you know, a key part of this. That I'll be honest, like, I was not aware of that 1988 firing. So it's something that has not been a big part of the story.
Yeah, and even at the time, like, I remember asking Dave when I talked to him, and, you know, he gave me that confirmation and stuff. He told me that he wasn't even aware that until that conversation with Vince. He was gone and back so quickly that I don't even know if the wrestlers would have known. The only thing that, like, visibly changed really was that he wasn't the ring announcer on Wrestling Challenge anymore.
And do you feel any of that is a hesitation that there was not the ability to prove that this had actually happened? Like, this is obviously Vince McMahon in 1992. He's giving this statement as damage control, that he's like, that's where he's coming from, even though it is actually serving the opposite. Like, I just look at it that, were they taking Vince McMahon at face value that he had actually let him go in 88 versus that this was him simply using this as a defense? It's difficult.
Do you think, like, the context of it is why maybe it wasn't treated as a bigger deal at the time, is kind of what you're asking?
I guess I'm just looking at, like, what was the context of this phone call? Like, was this Vince McMahon speaking to them on the record and
knowing that these articles are coming? Yeah.
Knowing that these articles are coming. Are they looking at it as, do we have any proof that Mel Phillips was actually let go? Knowing this is 92, in the absence of the ability to go back and look at him, he disappears for however many weeks it is and come back. Like, as you were stating, like, you've gone through everything and it's very hard to find any records of this.
Yeah. I don't know. I just feel like there's something missing here because, like, once the story had broken and everyone's kind of taken seriously, what they did or didn't know is the story.
Mm-hmm.
That's what puzzles me with this. Like, people who are otherwise doing a fairly good job covering this story just didn't treat this as a big deal. Like, again, even Mushnick, like, I feel like, I mean, granted, Mushnick, I think, as time went on, did not do nearly good enough job explaining the issues he had with the company, and that allowed them, you know, more Attitude Era type time to kind of cast him as that villain to the fan base. And he certainly didn't help himself with the comments he made about wrestling fans that he later apologized for. But, like, I would think, like, once they kind of declared me their mortal enemy, like, you would think that Phil Mushnick would have, like, shouted from the rooftops, you know, Vince said this to me on the record. So, I just can't wrap my head around that, because that, once everything else is out there, that's the story, you know, other than if, you know, law enforcement was going to look into this and charge Phillips or anyone else. You know, it's, what did they know? When did they know it? And I just don't understand how that could not only be downplayed, even if not intentionally, but also just disappear from the narrative. Like, there is no good reason that even with not that many people knowing about this, there's no good reason that the people who were at least had a working familiarity, didn't know this consistently for the past quarter century plus.
So why don't you talk a little bit about like the fallout of this, the departures from the company, and how this is ultimately, kind of comes to its conclusion without any charges, and it's largely like this is the disappearance of Terry Garvin and Mel Phillips for the rest of their lives.
Yes, well, almost, because I found
Right.
It's not in the article. I don't know if you saw. Well, I guess from what you said just now, you saw what I tweeted the other day. One of the things I found in my research didn't go in the article because there was really no point in it or place for it. Mel Phillips tried to run an indie promotion in 1997, including shows at a middle school. And
In a commissioned state, too.
I guess it is New Hampshire as a commissioned state. And the one article I found about it from the Nashua newspaper, no one seems to have any idea about the allegations against him. And it didn't seem like the promotion was around long, because I could only find one set of results for one show in the Observer, and it was a different show from the one that's mentioned in the newspaper article. And I'm assuming that most people, outside of the immediate, New England scene that were actually working those shows just didn't realize it was him, which is why that never came up in any of the newsletters. So he does reemerge briefly there. And then later, he defaults on his storage unit, and that's where, the belt Mr. Perfect destroyed. That's how that ended up in collectors' hands. And I think Tom Burke had a bunch of his records as far as old schedules and stuff. As far as I know, nothing incriminating or anything in there, but that's really all anyone heard of him. And at times people wondered if he died, but he died in 2012, but no one knew because he was completely gone from wrestling and everything. There's not even a tiny local obituary.
Since the article came out, just give me a bit of a sense of what the response has been like, and have you been surprised at, certain aspects that have been focused on more than others? Tell us a little bit about the feedback you've received.
It's mostly been positive. I mean, I've seen a couple, on Reddit and stuff, kind of, this old story type of things, not realizing that there's a lot of new and newly uncovered and rediscovered stuff in there. But overall, it's been positive. Definitely seeing some of the, people just didn't know that it existed at all. Trying to think, one of the things that really stuck out to people, even though, there are really, I don't want to give levels of it, but things that would really be more shocking, I guess, is the story Chris Lowe's had told Tom Cole's lawyer about how he had shouted out to Honky Tonk Man using his real name, I guess saying, "Hey, Wayne," or something like that. And then Phillips stepping on his foot very hard. And then when he complained, Phillips just ripping his shoe off and rubbing his foot while muttering that he shouldn't have called Honky Tonk Man his real name. That seems to be a thing that just really stuck with people. Just because it's so weird and creepy. I think the just strangeness of it makes it jump out. Even if there are things that are more viscerally horrifying. That's the thing I've seen people mention a bunch. One thing I want to point out too, because most of the feedback not sure anyone has, there are a lot of documents that have never been available before that are linked in the story. One is even a little bit of an Easter egg, because when we talk about the law enforcement stuff, there's an FBI memo that I linked, but I actually linked the whole WWF FBI file that I have, which is 340 pages.
Yeah, so there's a lot you uncovered here.
Yeah, so if anyone wants to take a look at that, that's there. But, even though parts quoted, the whole Linda McMahon termination letter to Tom Cole is in there. And, as far as stuff that's linked, all three of those TV show transcripts I mentioned. I'm forgetting off the top of my head just because of how many edits we went through. But, the only stuff that's not linked is stuff where we would have had concerns over redactions and stuff. So, the interview transcripts with Chris Lose and his friend with Cole's lawyer, Mushnick's deposition transcript. What was the other one? Oh, and the lawsuit stuff filed by the guy who filed the lawsuit in 99 that had not come forward before, which no one knew about until Huffington Post mentioned in late 2016. Which that also led to one of the weirder WWE responses when we reached out. If you could go into that for a second while I take a sip of water.
Yeah. So this was, essentially a case that came up, and Jerry McDivitt responded to David talking about this 1999 case that I guess there was like a quiet dismissal of the suit. Is that accurate?
I mean, quiet in that no one knew about it at the time.
Yeah. And
like,
it's
no one
almost,
knew about this for 7
Jerry McDivitt
years.
is somewhat trying to just recollect if there was even a case in 1999. It seems that it's like very, very vague in terms of the memory of this case, much less the conclusion of it.
Yeah, which I find kind of, strange, because like he worked on this case, and we mentioned that in the article. Like, it's, look, he's done a lot of work for them. It wouldn't shock me if there was a genuine memory lapse there, and it just happened to be, something in the moment that someone might forget about, but they must have a list of all these somewhere, I would think.
This is what Jerry McDivitt says in the feature, quote, "I have no recall of that suit." This is in regards to the 1999 one, "as it was no doubt a frivolous claim. I do know that we did not settle any other claims in 1999 or at any other time regarding such matters. The simple truth is that despite all the publicity in the early 90s and the existence of a thorough federal investigation, Tom Cole and to a much lesser degree, Chris Lose are the only people who made foot fetish claims against Mel Phillips," end quote.
Two things there. One, that does sound oddly specific at the end. Two, 10 years ago, when Politico did their story, when Linda McMahon had her first Senate campaign, he said there were 3 ring boy settlements.
Well, and as you go on in the article to state that a motion to dismiss the case filed by WWE, the date is listed April 2000, that motion is filed and signed by Jerry McDivitt. And I mean, he's very specific to the year that there were no settlements in 1999.
Well, no, if that case was settled, it was not in 1999. It was in 2001 when the case was dismissed, if there was a settlement. And, look, it says in the article, we reached out to that guy and he said he couldn't talk because he had an NDA, which is the same thing that he said to Huffington Post.
Right.
So,
I mean, he states, here, there's no, they did not settle any other claims in 99 or at any other time regarding such matters. So I guess that is
right. So it's not just limited to 99. Yeah. So I honestly don't know what to think of that, because I have the records and, we have this allusion to an NDA. And then if you look at the docket from the case, it has the hallmarks of a settlement that, if you know what to look for, you see it. I suppose it's theoretically possible it's not, but it's where I believe it was a joint filing for dismissal with prejudice, which, with prejudice means you can't refile. And if it's jointly, then they would have come to an agreement, I think. So I'm not sure what to make of this. I mean, we didn't include the name in that part in the email, but I don't know how he wouldn't, know this fairly easily, because I gotta think this is one of the topics he knows like the back of his hand. But also, that it would be easy to still find out regardless. So I just don't get that part at all. That just was very strange.
Looking at this feature, just like the larger preparation for something this deep, can you just give like our listeners a sense, David, of like the time that went into this, and also like the manpower as well to put together something like this? And like, just give me a sense as well, like from the perspective of a freelance journalist needing to have like a major company to do this on their platform as well.
Okay, so where should I start with that?
I know it's a kind of loaded question.
Yes, that's okay. I mean, as far as the last part, I mean,
Like, could you have done this on your own?
no.
So
No.
I that's essentially what I'm going at here. And I think that's important to look at as well in a lot of these complicated stories that, I mean, there have been no shortage of this year related to professional wrestling.
Yeah. And I think it's a good opportunity to talk about that, real quick. There's a few things going on there. I mean, that you need some kind of institutional support really to do this right. Because, look, even if nothing else, to be able to reach out to people for comment, I needed, a place that had a subscription to a database like a LexisNexis or something similar to be able to get people's contact info. That's if nothing else, but also just in general, like having an experienced editor like John Cook, who I thought did a phenomenal job, having a legal review, having legal support if something were to happen. Like, these are all really important things. And then also to dovetail with speaking out and all that. I won't say who, but there was a fairly well-known women's wrestler I was talking to recently who said something to me that it was something I kind of had a feeling of, but no one had ever really said to me outright, that when mainstream reporters reach out to women in wrestling about, topics related to sexual misconduct and similar things, they tend not to trust them if they're people who don't really know wrestling. But then on the flip side, they know that people who cover the wrestling beat are not necessarily going to have either the skill set or the institutional support or anything like that to do that correctly. So, like, it's very clear why I was almost said Me Too, which was to a degree, but speaking out had to be this self-driven movement. Like, it was never going to go a different way whenever something like that was going to happen. And also, unfortunately, it's all of that together is also complicated covering it because, aside from some of the UK stuff done carefully because of the investigations and all that, there's been very little mainstream coverage because it doesn't really fit into the model of how a mainstream outlet will cover sexual assault and sexual harassment these days, which is, if you're getting a specific allegation from an individual, you go to, who are the people you've told before? Do you have a contemporaneous outcry? You investigate it as best you can. And if it all points in one direction, then you seem to have a legitimate story. But because of all the factors we just discussed, that's not going to happen with a lot of this stuff, unfortunately. And look, there needs to be, I don't know what the answer is on this, on how we can do this better, short of, look, I need to look into it more. I've only started to. Like, Freelancers Union apparently has gotten a group liability insurance plan that covers defamation. It's not gigantic. I want to say it caps out, including legal fees, at like $2 million, which, yes, that is not gigantic by that standard. So that's obviously something that would help. And also, this story involves male victims, but fact of the matter is, until we have more female reporters on this beat, there's always going to be that kind of reticence too, and understandably so. Like, am I thankful for her and very respectful of, like, women who have confided things in me in wrestling? Absolutely. But I can't go around to other people and start asking because I'm just a straight white dude. I'm not, I can't just go to them. I'm not going to have the inherent trust that another woman would. So investigating these type of things around wrestling is unfortunately a much more uphill battle than it would be really anywhere else that has its own kind of, large, reporter beat like wrestling does.
And we can,
and then the other part too. Yes. So I'm not sure if that's where you wanted to go just now with the preparation for the article.
Yeah, I guess give us a sense of like I imagine this is like months worth of research and digging and interviews that go into this, but I'm just kind of curious about that process and maybe even just like what was the impetus to dive into this in terms of like what did you just feel like there were aspects to this that were not widely reported on? Like where is square one on a story like this for you?
So I put a lot of time into this, but with the caveat that some of it was on and off originally. But like, just to give you an idea, this was originally a Deadspin story.
Okay.
So like, that gives you an idea of how, like, originally how long. And then, I ended up going to Business Insider after everything, imploded there. And, between COVID and other stuff got delayed. But it was for the best because, like, for example, Mel Phillips's former friend that we source in the article, like, I would not have had access to that person, for the story because they didn't come along through a referral from someone else until fairly late. So that was all for the best. But yeah, a lot went into this. I mean, when I talk about Phil Mushnick's archives, I went to the dude's house. Like, he let me go through all of his wrestling-centric boxes in his attic, let me borrow the stuff I couldn't scan that day.
Wow.
Like, so that was part of it. We had pulled both the Geraldo and the Mushnick / New York Post lawsuits, which, had a lot of useful stuff in them, like the, original Tom Cole complaint. And then, Phil had other stuff like his deposition, like he had a copy of the Cole settlement. He had the Linda letter, which I think were the things that weren't public, I think, like the Tom Cole centric stuff, I think he got from the Coles, like, around, like, when all their depositions were being taken in, like, late 93. So, there was that. There were, I don't even remember, I don't think it was with this in mind, actually, when I filed the Freedom of Information Act request on the whole, like, WWF file. And, that one is mostly about steroids and related stuff, but I had to do that and wait on that. And, I had filed a separate one about Phillips once I had the proof of death for him, which, that's a whole other can of worms that's addressed in the story. But, a lot of that type of stuff in there, certain interviews, some that I was, sitting on for a while. And it was a lot of work. And then we went through a lot of, editing and kind of smoothing things over with this. And, look, there's other stuff I'd like to be able to talk about with this, but as I was, reminded by my editor, not in like a negative way, but like it's a dense story with a lot of names. So to make it a more readable story, there's stuff that could be in there that's not.
Is there a lot that you could find like beyond like the New York Post coverage and the sporadic articles like did something like the New York Times like even touch this at the time? Like today, this is a massive scandal if this happens today. And
even in wrestling, right? Yes.
This certainly gets outside the bubble of pro wrestling in a big degree. But at the time, like this really feels like it was confined to newsletter coverage, the Post, and your Donahues and current affairs.
I mean, pretty much. New York Times, I don't think did anything. LA Times did a story. I think it was Houston Mitchell, longtime Observer subscriber, and I can't remember who the other one was. It might have been John Cherwa, because I think it was a collaboration, but it might be someone else. They did an LA Times story, but it was focused on the drug stuff with like a passing reference to the other articles that had come out that week, because it was from that week in March 92. As far as national papers, I think that's it. Other national news coverage, again, it was mostly tabloid shows and daytime talk shows. Like, it's strange, but it's not because it's wrestling.
Yeah, and I think everyone should watch that Donahue show. And like, you can see in the tone of Phil Donahue that this is a very serious story. Like, there's no punchline to any of this. And yet you can see in his handling of this, like part of it, like this guy is a talk show host, but he is like injecting like humor lines into different parts. It's almost like, look what's happening at the circus. Like that's sort of the backdrop to that very serious subject matter.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like he overall did a good job with that episode. I mean, aside from the weirdness of that the episode is named after the Ring Boy scandal, but doesn't really mention it for the most part. But, I think that's more just his style. Like, I feel like overall he treated it with the correct gravity. But really, you see towards the end when they're taking the audience questions,
isn't wrestling fake? Like
yeah,
that really sums up, I think, what the public at large and what their conclusion is. And that probably informs your answer about the larger coverage that, if this was happening in Major League Baseball or a major entertainment company, a television studio, this would have been treated with a lot more coverage at the time. But this is professional wrestling in 1992.
Yeah, I mean, her exchange, that audience member with Donahue, and I have the transcript up here, and it's online too if you want to watch it, but for right now, she asks, isn't wrestling fixed anyway? And Donahue responds, isn't wrestling fixed anyway? No, that's a creative decision who wins. The snake loses, the good guy wins. This is about crime. This is about breaking the law. And he's right. And,
Yep.
To his credit, he treated it seriously. Again, part of it is probably that there were stories being worked on that just did get killed or whatever. I believe there was a CBS Evening News feature. I always forget how much of that was related to the, Titan Gate, sexual harassment and sexual abuse scandals, and how much was steroids, because I think that's the one where I had tweeted that clip of Vince saying that basically everyone's out to get him. I think that's what that's from. So it probably did allude to some of this, but I don't know. It's like in the TV stuff, like aside from that part near the end of the Now It Can Be Told episode, I'm not sure Tom Cole's name is ever mentioned. And, the brief mention on Larry King too. Or I don't think Chris Lowe's name is mentioned once. I don't know if it's because of the interview availability. Probably a lot of it is, but it seemed like the TV coverage ended up mostly focusing on Pat Patterson and Terry Garvin.
Yeah, I would imagine a lot of people reading your feature are hearing about Chris Lowe's for the first time. Like, I don't think that's a very widely known name that's attached to this story.
Right.
And
if they know
clearly by his
name,
design, he clearly didn't, I don't think, wanted to be front and center for this. Like, he is very much, detached from this as Tom Cole becomes kind of your front-facing victim of the scandal.
Yeah, he did, yeah. He just kind of vanished pretty quickly after everything broke. Like, clearly, obviously he was a participant in that first story, but no one ever hears from him again, really. I have it in the story, Mike Sawyer saying, they had been friends, but, he kind of went to talk with WWE, came back and just seemed like a different guy. And then I think after a while, they just never heard from him again.
I'll finish up on this. So in light of the recent news of a Vince McMahon documentary series on Netflix, what is your thought process on this being broached at all in that documentary series? Would you say likely or unlikely?
Okay, so I'm going to give a caveat on this. I think there is a decent likelihood of them addressing Titan Gate in some form, but not specifically this. I think they will address it in some larger, broader fashion if they do, where they center on stuff like Murray Hodgson's, discredited allegations against Pat Patterson, Billy Graham retracting his allegation that he saw Pat Patterson grabbing a kid's crotch. That would be my gut, that if they address it at all. And the reason I say that is because was in the last couple of weeks, Lavi Margolin tweeted pictures from the 50th anniversary of WWE book they put out in 2013, which I think I have here, but I've never really read, and talking about the steroid trial and stuff. And I think they mentioned some of this stuff in passing, and they also allude to stuff that is really clearly more about the Ring Boy scandal and stuff like that, but kind of conflate it with the steroid scandal. Like the big example being I should mention this. This is not in the article, but this is something that endlessly fascinates me. They were obsessed with, in, I believe, the same column that had the initial description of his conversation with Vince, that Phil Mushnick had said that Hannibal Lecter was the only fictional character that came close to being as evil as Vince McMahon was. And when I say obsessed, they mentioned it, 2 decades later in that book, in that chapter, about how ridiculous it was that he'd say that. They mention it endlessly in the lawsuit. They mentioned it constantly in any interviews, like when Linda McMahon talked to Mike Mooneyham a few months after the lawsuits filed. They just kept bringing that up. I think there was even a response from the spokesman at the time, Steve Plantamena, that addressed it. Like, I may be getting that one wrong, but they just kept bringing this up over and over. And even and it's one of those things that makes you wonder about the whole Russo arrival in WWE, not to open that can of worms, but clearly they had his ear, it seems like, back in 92, because when he briefly has his own newsletter and he's going off on the scandal coverage and he's going off on Mushnick, one of the big things he really tries to attack is that line. So, they have their certain quirks that I think, depending on how many episodes it is and how comprehensive it is, it would not be surprising for them to bring it up in a very limited, hagiographic form, if that makes sense. But, I mean, the thing that also I'm really curious about with that documentary is also the timeline relative to when it'll come out, relative to when Craig Marks and Rob Tannenbaum's WWE Oral History book will come out, because, and I'm guessing they're regretting this if they're now doing this, multi-episode Vince documentary that they sold to Netflix, because while they have WWE access, Marks and Tannenbaum, they've interviewed Vince and stuff, and they have access to, I think, records and photos and all that. They're not beholden to WWE at all. WWE has no control over that book. And I'm wondering, with this announcement of this documentary series, besides, what you talked about last week on some of the shows about how probably the Undertaker documentary being well received made them more likely to sell something like this. But it makes me wonder if they're regretting giving Craig Marks and Rob Tannenbaum that kind of access over something they can't control, and want to make sure they have some kind of Vince bio out there that they can control.
It's a really perplexing one. Where is the need for them to go that route of giving up control for a Vince McMahon project? It sounds stunning when you lay it out like that.
Well, I mean, technically it's a WWE oral history, but still, that's not how they view things. Especially these days. Especially after, Wrestling with Shadows and Beyond the Mat. Granted, those are movies, but it seemed like they were never going to give up that kind of control to anyone again. So when, the news broke that they were doing this book that had the access but were not beholden to them, I mean, it was shocking. That book's still a while from coming out. Last I heard, they're still doing the interviews. But, if they're doing a extensive, a Netflix level, Netflix quality documentary series, that's going to take quite a while too. So it's going to be interesting to see those two things battling. And then also, I think that this documentary is happening in this form. That makes me think also that they're not going to try to pursue the, fictionalized, dramatized Vince movie, and that they just bought that weird script to kill it. Which, have you read that script?
Oh, I read the one that came out.
You saw saw the key parts.
Yeah.
It was not a good script, but clearly there were some people interested in it, and I got to think they bought it just so no one would make it. And what? Understandably so. It wasn't even a thing of it being controversial. It was just bad and just weird.
Well, Dave, I want to give you the forum here of where everyone can go check this out if they haven't already. You can go to businessinsider.com. I understand there's also a version of Business Insider in India if people want to seek that out. And I do let people know about all that they can listen to at Between the Sheets.
Yes. Okay. So BusinessInsider.com has the article. At the moment is behind their paywall. Business Insider India apparently does not, which is, I don't know why, but it has the same article. So, look, I'll say that. I'll put it this way.
I'll say it for you. Like this, as David outlined here, and one of the reasons I want to ask the question is that you don't just churn this out overnight. This requires a ton of work, and it goes beyond just David's work. It's a lot of people. And if you want like reporting like this, it doesn't come with no cost. Like there is a value to this, and like do support this kind of work if it's the kind of stuff that you are seeking out. It's a very different time in this media landscape where I think people are becoming much more comfortable. Our site is a direct benefactor of that, where people are willing to spend money on things that they support. So, by all means, go support this. I'm not like advocating to get around paywalls.
Right, no, I know. I mean, it's, as someone who wants people to read my story, I want people to read it no matter what. But like I was going to say, like, look, they have reinvested the money they've made from the subscriptions doing well into hiring a lot more reporters, being able to pay so that I can actually devote time to something like this article. Like, if you're able to at least do like the month trial, like for $1 thing, please do it. I mean, if you're not, I understand, and just pull up the version on Business Insider India and you're fine. But it would, like I said, this doesn't go to me, but it allows them to be able to do stuff like this. And the fact that they've clearly reinvested it so much in more reporters, being able to pay freelancers like me well, etc. Like, I really do kind of admire that. So, if you can, please do that. If you're not able to, or just looking for a link you can click on, the Indian version, for whatever reason, seems to be good. I'm guessing it's an economy thing where they just don't have a paywall there, but check that out. And then as far as my other stuff, so yes, Between the Sheets podcast that myself and Chris Zellner do every week, where we go over how a given week in history was covered in the wrestling newsletters. The new episode that just came out looks at 1995, the week of both Halloween Havoc 95 with the monster trucks and Giant falling off the roof and the Yeti and all that. Oh, and Lex Luger turning heel in the background of Jimmy Hart's heel turn. Can't forget that one. That's part of this week's coverage. The ECW fire incident. ECW Arena fire incident, I should say, with Terry Funk and Cactus Jack and the fan getting burned. With our guest, Joe Sposto, past commentator for Chikara, GCW, and a bunch of other promotions. He's on the show and was at that ECW Arena show. So we have his firsthand account, all sorts of other stuff from all over the world that week. You can find that wherever you find podcasts. Just look. There are other podcasts named Between the Sheets, so just make sure it's the one hosted by Chris Zellner and myself. And check that out. And we also have Patreon at patreon.com/Between the Sheets, where we do at least, every month you'll always get a deep dive on a certain topic. The one that just went up is part 4 in a series of what'll probably be 6 episodes on the ECW on TNN run and all the insanity around that, which I've been learning a lot doing this, and I think the listeners have too, because there is a lot, especially in the Torch, because the Torch is the publication to read for ECW in that era, because it was basically Jason Powell's whole job to report on ECW. So there's a lot in there, and like I said, it's $5 a month to get the bonus shows. We've been doing, over 4 years now of bonus shows, lots of deep dives. There are some, if you want to hear what they're like, in the free feed as well. We've put in one of the shows we did on Global Wrestling Federation. We put together the 2 episodes we did on Herb Abrams several months back when Dark Side of the Ring did their Herb Abrams episode. And this week we'll also be releasing for free the episode we did on Sid Vicious's departure from WCW in 91 and his run WWF and how that all goes astray. So that's patreon.com/Between the Sheets. You can follow me on Twitter at David Bix. And also I have my Substack, babyfacevheel.com, which, newsletter/blog, which is where I put basically the stuff I'm not putting up and elsewhere. But, I do break news there, like my Matt Riddle Candy Cartwright stories are all up there. And if you want to also support my work through there, you can. And that we have I have $5 a month or $50 a year subscriptions, and I try to put up sometimes some exclusive stuff for the subscribers. And now that this article is out too, because there was I have banked, like, I wanted to start the podcast for that blog, Babyface v. Hill, but there was stuff I had banked. Like, I did 2 parts with David Roth on the Mushnick lawsuit, but I kind of wanted to wait till the article was out to be able to speak freely, I guess is the best way to put it. So hopefully that'll be coming soon as well. And the podcast will be free, but like there will be extras once that starts going up that will be exclusive for subscribers. So everyone check that out. And thank you for having me.
Our pleasure, David. Wonderful work on this feature. Hope that there are more to come. So go to businessinsider.com, follow him at David Bix on Twitter. We'll be back later tonight. Nate Miltons is going to be joining me for Rewind to Raw as we go into the federal election. So enjoy a day off tomorrow, Bix, as you follow all of the election coverage. God knows what's in store. We're just watching here from Canada. What's in store?
I mean, it's enough that, like, let me put it this way: there's a payment from Vice that I have to decide whether or not to get by wire transfer or check, and I'm trying to figure out right now if I want to have to fret about a check coming in the mail with everything going on that I need.
I don't have the energy in me to go into the election, but I'm sure we'll be chatting about it tonight with Nate. So check all of that out. And once again, a big thank you to David Bixenspan for joining us here at Post Wrestling.